Imagine this. A farmer plows his field, the warm spring sun overhead, when suddenly his horse stumbles, its leg sinking into the soft earth. The man curses, dismounts, and pulls away the soil. But what he uncovers is not a rock, not a root, not the ordinary obstacles of rural life. It's a chest, old wood, nailed shut, stained black by time. He pries it open, and inside lies a skeleton, bones stacked like discarded firewood, a skull caved in by violence. That chest was not supposed to be found. It was the kind of secret the earth itself tried to bury. That was 1829, on the borderlands of Delaware and Maryland. And what that farmer stumbled upon was not a single crime. It was the unmasking of one of America's most chilling and forgotten enterprises. Behind those bones lay the story of a woman whose name became a whispered curse, Patty Cannon. And before we go deeper, before I pull you down into this darkness, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What city? What state? Write it in the comments below, because history like this spreads differently when men across America stand together in remembering it. Now, let's descend. Patty Cannon's name barely appears in your history books, but for nearly 2 decades, she ruled a hidden empire, a network historians now call the Reverse Underground Railroad. While men like Harriet Tubman would later guide enslaved people to freedom, Patty Cannon ran a shadow system in the opposite direction. She hunted free African Americans, she kidnapped runaway slaves who had finally tasted liberty, and she sold them back into bondage, profiting from human suffering in an era when the legal slave trade had been outlawed. But don't mistake her for just another trafficker in human flesh. No. Patty Cannon was something darker, something more dangerous. She wasn't merely greedy, she was a predator, a killer. Her empire was soaked in blood. Witnesses said she murdered rivals, betrayed allies, slaughtered children when their cries threatened to expose her hiding places. Court records indicted her for 4 murders. Locals whispered the number was more than 20. And here's what chills me most. She was not some outlaw hiding in the wilderness, chased day and night by lawmen. She thrived in plain sight, protected by borders, by prejudice, by apathy. She built her power on the fact that her victims were people society had already decided not to see. Their disappearances were barely noted, their suffering rarely recorded, their cries drowned in indifference. The soil that swallowed those bones. It had covered up years of complicity. Patty Cannon wasn't alone. Her neighbors knew. Merchants sold to her gang. Law enforcement looked the other way. Even judges and officials wrapped in the politics of their time allowed her reign to stretch on. Her crimes weren't hidden because she was clever. They were hidden because society itself provided her with the perfect camouflage: racism, greed, and the silence of those who dared not interfere. Think about that. Think about how many atrocities in history are not buried by secrecy, but by the willingness of institutions to ignore them. That is the darker truth. That is what makes this story bigger than Patty Cannon. When her husband Jesse died, suspiciously, perhaps poisoned, she inherited his land. A property straddling the state line, where one step across a threshold could mean the difference between Delaware jurisdiction and Maryland law. And in that no-man's land, she built her empire. Her house looked like any other frontier home, wooden walls, shuttered windows, but beneath it, hidden chambers waited, chambers built not for grain or storage, but for human beings. Imagine the fear, a family walking down a country road, the sun setting, a wagon slows beside. Them, a man offers work, maybe food, maybe safe passage, and then, in an instant, the offer becomes a trap. Chains. Darkness. Days later, the family is gone, erased, swallowed into Patty Cannon's system. And still she smiled to her neighbors. Still she kept her tavern open. Still she raised her children while shackling the children of others beneath her floorboards. This is where our descent begins. Not just into the story of a woman, but into the hidden machinery of a society that let her exist. A society that profited from her crimes. A society that tells you in your history books only half the story. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The borderland where Patty Cannon thrived was no ordinary countryside. It was a natural fortress for crime. Thick pine forests swallowed the horizon, marshes bled into rivers, and the nearest towns were days away by horse. Roads were little more than muddy ruts carved through wilderness, and here, at a crossroads locals called Johnson's Crossroads, stood the tavern that would become the beating heart of her empire. This was not random geography, it was strategy. 3 jurisdictions collided here: Sussex County, Delaware, Caroline and Dorchester counties, Maryland. Step across the line and the law behind you vanished. Sheriffs from one county had no authority in the next, and criminals knew it. The tavern itself, later known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was literally built across the state line. A man pursued by Delaware lawmen could simply walk into the Maryland side of the house and laugh at their warrants. It was here that Patty Cannon turned the weaknesses of the American legal system into weapons. She understood something that few dared admit. Laws are not protections, they are cages. And if you learn how to slip between the bars, you can move in the shadows freely, while others remain trapped inside. Her operation was not crude thuggery. It was a network. Her gang included slave kidnappers, blacksmiths, tavern keepers, and even men of mixed race who could infiltrate black communities without raising suspicion. They had decoys. They had scouts. They had scouts. They had a system. One man in particular, John Purnell, described in court records as yellow or mulatto, could shift identities like a chameleon. Sometimes he posed as a free black laborer looking for work. Other times he passed as white, dealing directly with buyers in the Deep South. He was a bridge between worlds, and in an era built on rigid racial lines that made him priceless to the Cannon enterprise. The methods of the gang were as simple as they were devastating: deception, force, silence. They would approach families with promises of labor. Parents desperate for opportunity would send their children with these employers. The children never returned. Others were snatched off lonely roads, beaten into submission, shackled before they could scream. And once they were taken, the captives disappeared into hidden rooms. Rooms beneath Patty Cannon's home. Rooms beneath Johnson's Tavern. Rooms designed not for comfort, but for concealment. Chains embedded into stone. Ventilation shafts just wide enough to let in air but not light. Iron rings to keep wrists bound, while the outside world drank ale and laughed above their heads. Can you imagine the psychology of that confinement? Hearing footsteps above you, muffled conversations, laughter, music, while you are in darkness, chained like an animal, awaiting transport to a fate worse than death. That was the daily reality of Patty Cannon's victims. But here's the deeper corruption. Everyone knew, or at least enough people knew. Neighbors whispered about wagons arriving at strange hours, about children vanishing, about men who traveled south with cargo, never to be seen again. Yet the silence was deafening. Why? Because the victims were free African Americans. And in the early 1800s, their lives carried little weight in white society. They had no political power, no legal protection, no allies who could force the courts to act. They were vulnerable, and Patty Cannon built her empire on that vulnerability. But don't think for a moment that her violence was limited to black victims. She was cunning enough to know that sometimes even the powerful must be destroyed. Slave traders from the South, traveling north with cash, were also her prey. She would lure them into her tavern with whiskey, food, and smiles, then rob them, kill them, bury their bodies in the soil of Delaware. White men, legal slave traders, murdered and stripped of their wealth, their corpses hidden alongside the people they had come to buy. That is why her neighbors began to whisper. That is why her name carried weight even among the ruthless. She was not just another criminal profiting off the slave trade. She was a predator who turned on her own kind, and still the law barely touched her. This is the lesson. Power protects power. As long as her crimes served the machinery of slavery, as long as the bodies she buried were people society had already written off, she was untouchable. It was only when moneyed white men went missing that her empire began to attract serious attention. And you must understand, this is not just history, it is a mirror. Every system, every empire, every society has its blind spots, its chosen victims whose suffering can be ignored. That is where corruption breeds. That is where predators rise. Patty Cannon exploited the silence of her era. Today's predators exploit the silence of ours. Now the descent deepens. We've seen the tavern, the chambers, the network, but to truly understand the empire of Patty Cannon, we need to look at the economy that made her possible, the cotton boom, the outlawing of African imports, the insatiable hunger of the Deep South for human bodies, because behind every act of violence there is always a system that profits. And once you see that system, you can never look at history the same way again. Evil never survives on violence alone. Violence is the tool, but profit is the engine. And if you want to understand how Patty Cannon reigned for 2 decades, you must follow the money. In 1808, the United States outlawed the international slave trade. Ships from Africa could no longer legally bring enslaved people to American shores. At least, that's what the law claimed. In truth, smuggling continued in secret. But the real impact was this: supply shrank and demand exploded. The Deep South was growing like a wildfire. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had transformed cotton from a luxury crop into the empire's fuel. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, fields expanded endlessly, swallowing land, swallowing labor, swallowing lives. Cotton was white gold, and it demanded an army of enslaved workers. And here is where the machinery turns dark. A man in 1800 might pay $300 for a strong, young enslaved worker. After 1808, that same man would pay over $1,000. That's not inflation. That's desperation. That's scarcity driving human bodies into the realm of luxury commodities. Imagine it, one healthy man's life priced higher than most family farms. A young woman valued not only for her labor, but for the children she could bear. Children who would themselves be enslaved, multiplying profit like livestock breeding stock. And in this bloody marketplace, the free black communities of the North and Mid-Atlantic became prey. In Maryland and Delaware, emancipation laws and manumissions after the Revolutionary War had created a fragile class of free African Americans. They lived as artisans, farmers, and laborers. They were citizens in name, but not in power. They could not vote. They could not serve on juries. In most courts, they could not even testify against a white criminal. Their freedom was paper-thin, easily torn away. That paper was literally their shield. Free. Dom papers. Every free black person was required to carry them, documents proving their status. Lose them, and you could be claimed as a runaway. Have them stolen, and you were nothing. And this legal vulnerability was the opening Patty Cannon exploited. Her gang kidnapped men, women, and children from the very communities that trusted the law to protect them. They seized their papers, destroyed their possessions, erased their names, and sold them into the Deep South as if they had never been free at all. Imagine the terror, knowing that your entire life could be wiped out with one forged bill of sale, that your word meant nothing, that your identity could be stolen, and no one in authority would believe you. This was not random crime. This was a supply chain. The Cannon gang fed a hunger that began in Washington politics, ran through southern plantations, and ended in the pockets of men who trafficked in flesh. Patty Cannon's tavern was not an isolated den of evil. It was one cog in a vast, invisible machine. Think of the logistics. A family kidnapped in Delaware might be held for weeks in hidden chambers, waiting until enough victims were gathered for transport. Then they were chained, loaded into wagons, moved by night across the countryside, passed from one handler to another like contraband. The rivers, the marshes, the unmarked cart paths, every natural feature became part of the system. Eventually they were marched south, often hundreds of miles, until they disappeared into auction blocks in Georgia, Mississippi, or Louisiana. By the time their feet hit southern soil, their names were gone, their pasts erased, their futures consumed by cotton fields and overseers' whips. Do you see it now? Do you see why history tried to bury Patty Cannon's name? Because to confront her is to confront the truth that evil does not exist outside of society, it exists with it and its bloodstream. Her violence thrived because it was useful, her cruelty endured because it was profitable. and her victims vanished because their lives were deemed expendable in a system that measured human beings by dollars and harvest yields. And yet, she was a woman. In an age when women were dismissed as weak, fragile, incapable of commanding fear, Patty Cannon inverted the myth. She stood 6 feet tall, broad, with a voice that neighbors described as deep and commanding. A widow with land, with connections, with ruthlessness. She did not just participate in this black market, she mastered it. She became the nightmare men whispered about, but dared not confront. This is the heart of forbidden history. The predators are not always kings, generals, or presidents. Sometimes they are the ones history almost forgets, the ones who learned to twist the system's blind spots into weapons. And now, as we descend further, we must step into the darkness of her methods. The kidnappings, the murders, the bodies buried under her soil. Because profit alone does not explain the savagery of Patty Cannon. Some crimes are driven by money, others by something far darker. By now you see the machine, the economy that demanded flesh, the loopholes in law that allowed it, the silence of neighbors that protected it. But the machine does not run on paper alone. It runs on terror. And Patty Cannon understood terror like few others. Imagine walking a lonely road in 1825. The sun is sinking, the woods around you thick and quiet. You're a free man, or so you believe. In your pocket are your papers, proof that you are not a runaway, proof that you have earned your life. And then you hear wheels behind you, a wagon creaks, men step down, a smile, a friendly voice. Brother, do you need work? There's a farm down south paying good wages. But the smile is a mask. The next moment, the voice hardens. Hands seize you, a blow to the head, your papers torn away, chains on your wrists. Darkness. By morning, you are gone, erased. That was the signature of Patty Cannon's gang, the blending of deception with force. They lured the desperate with promises, then snatched them when hope blinded them. They ambushed the unwary on country roads. They targeted children, pulling them from homes while parents were powerless to stop it. And once inside Cannon's system, escape was nearly impossible. Court testimony tells us of Lydia Smith, a free woman kidnapped in 1825. She was chained beneath Patty Cannon's house for months. She described the iron rings driven into stone, the suffocating dark, the cries of children echoing through the floorboards. Food was scarce, sanitation non-existent. She lived in constant dread, knowing she was marked for transport south. Her words, preserved in records, show the raw cruelty of Cannon's empire, not just the physical suffering, but the stripping away of identity. Smith and others were renamed, given false backstories to legitimize their enslavement, beaten until they answered to lies. And when captives resisted, Patty Cannon made examples of them. Neighbors whispered that she killed children, babies even, when their cries threatened to draw attention. Witnesses claimed she poisoned her own husband, and rivals, slave traders, smugglers, fellow traffickers, were lured into her tavern, given drink, then robbed, murdered, buried in shallow graves. The chest the farmer unearthed in 1829 was only one piece of the puzzle. Other bodies were found nearby, at least 7, including children. Locals whispered that more lay hidden, scattered across the borderland, forever silenced under the soil. Officially, she was indicted for 4 murders. Unofficially, the number was far higher. But here's the most chilling truth. People knew. They heard the cries. They saw the wagons. They watched neighbors vanish. And yet few spoke. Why? Because fear is contagious. To accuse Patty Cannon was to risk her wrath, and in a world where lawmen were corrupt, where courts dismissed black testimony, where money silenced justice, what good would it do? So the silence spread. Silence that was more powerful than any weapon, silence that protected Patty Cannon as surely as her tavern walls. But silence alone did not build her aura. She had something else. Presence. Eyewitnesses described her as towering nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women barely cleared 5. Her voice was low, commanding, sharp as a whip crack. She could drink men under the table, fight them with her fists, cow them with her glare. She was not just a criminal, she was a force of nature, a woman who bent the myths of her time to her will. This is what you must see clearly. Patty Cannon thrived not only because of the system's weaknesses, but because she weaponized psychology. She ruled by fear, by aura, by legend. Children grew up in Delaware and Maryland, hearing her name like a curse. Grown men looked over their shoulders when traveling near her cave, and even among criminals she was respected, dreaded, obeyed. And that is the hidden truth of power. It is not enough to have money, or violence, or land. Real power is psychological. Patty Cannon's power did not rise in isolation. No empire of terror can be built by a single pair of hands. To turn kidnapping into an industry, to transform one tavern into the beating heart of the reverse Underground Railroad, she needed soldiers, men willing to trade morality for coin, family ties for blood. And so, slowly, deliberately, she gathered a gang. At first, it was the men closest to her. Her first husband, Jesse Cannon, was said to be a violent drifter who died early, leaving her free to command her household with an iron hand. Later came Joe Johnson, her son-in-law, a man as brutal and ambitious as she was. Johnson was the muscle, Patty the brain. Together they became a partnership of terror. Some stories even whisper that Johnson was more than a son-in-law, that their relationship blurred the lines of family and crime, cemented less by marriage than by shared cruelty. From there, the circle widened. Patty recruited from her kin, her tavern regulars, the restless men who haunted crossroads and ferry stops in search of easy profit. These were men who knew the marshes, who could navigate by river and back road, who could vanish into the night with their victims before alarm bells ever rang. Some were relatives by blood, others by marriage, but all became bound to her by complicity. Once you stole a child for Patty Cannon, you were hers forever. Silence was no longer a choice, it was survival. The gang's structure was loose, but its purpose was clear. Some acted as scouts, lingering in free black communities across Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. They studied their targets, families with land, children who played too far from home, laborers walking alone at night. Others were the hunters, armed with clubs, ropes, and pistols ready to strike. And then there were the drivers, the men who handled the wagons, who could load captives under false floorbore, dice, or cover them with hay, turning human cargo into something invisible to the law. Patty herself did not always swing the whip or bind the ropes, but she orchestrated it all. She was the eye at the center of the storm, the one who decided who would be taken, when they would move, where they would be sold. Witnesses later recalled how she would stand at the doorway of her tavern, arms folded, eyes sharp as flint, watching her men drive wagons southward into the night. She was not merely complicit, she was commander. The gang grew bold. They staged kidnappings in daylight. They raided homes. They lured free black children with promises of sweets, only to lock them in wagons bound for the Carolinas. Their reach extended across state lines. Pennsylvania newspapers began reporting strange disappearances in Chester County, and whispers followed the trail south to Delaware, where Patty's name was already spoken with fear. And still, the law did nothing. Local sheriffs turned a blind eye, either out of fear of retaliation or because their own pockets were greased. Jurors refused to convict, muttering that the testimony of a black witness was worth less than the word of a white criminal. Judges dragged their feet, evidence mysteriously vanished, and even when charges were filed, Patty and her men walked free. Each acquittal emboldened them further. The gang became notorious, but also untouchable. Neighbors knew, travelers whispered, but knowledge without action is only another form of silence. And so, year by year, crime by crime, Patty Cannon's gang grew into a small empire. What made it more chilling was the intimacy of it all. These were not strangers in masks, they were neighbors, husbands, fathers, sons. Patty did not rely on outlaws from distant lands, but on the men who lived and worked among the same communities they preyed upon. It was betrayal at the most personal level, the friendly handshake at the tavern, followed by the nighttime knock on your door. By the 1820s, Patty Cannon was no longer just a woman running a tavern. She was the matriarch of a gang that stretched across counties, feeding the hungry maw of southern markets. Every man in her circle owed her, and every victim they stole deepened her wealth and power. The queen of the kidnappers had built her court. And it was only the beginning. To understand the terror Patty Cannon unleashed, one must look closely at the methods. She and her gang were not simply brutes who dragged victims away in the dark. They were cunning hunters, skilled manipulators, and ruthless opportunists. Their arsenal of tricks was wide, and every tactic preyed on the vulnerabilities of the free black communities around them. The simplest weapon was deceit. Children were easy targets. A kind smile, a sweet, a promise of a ride in the wagon. This was often all it took to lure a boy or girl from the safety of their yard. Some were enticed with the promise of work, a few pennies for carrying bundles, a day's wages for helping with chores. They would step willingly into the wagon, only to find themselves bound before they could cry out. Adults required more calculation. Sometimes the gang posed as friendly traders or labor recruiters, offering good wages on distant farms. A handshake sealed the lie, and by nightfall, the workers were shackled in a hidden cellar, destined for the South. Other times, violence was direct. Victims walking alone were ambushed, beaten unconscious, and thrown into wagons like sacks of grain. Patty's gang was especially skilled at exploiting the legal twilight between slavery and freedom. Papers could be forged. A kidnapped free man could be claimed as an escaped slave, and once across the Mason-Dixon line, the lie was nearly impossible to disprove. In Maryland or Virginia, who would dare question a white trader's word? A black captive had no standing in court. Testimony was worthless, and so with a few false documents and a convincing story, Patty's men could sell a freeborn farmer as property, pocket the cash, and vanish. The geography of the Delmarva Peninsula aided their crimes. Marshes, forests, and backroads offered endless cover. The gang learned to move silently at night, their wagons rattling over hidden trails. If pursuit came too close, captives could be stashed in barns, abandoned shacks, or the tavern's underground cells until the danger passed. Neighbors often heard muffled cries but turned away, telling themselves it was none of their business. Alcohol and drugs, too, became tools of capture. Some victims were invited into the tavern with the promise of drink, only to wake hours later in chains. Rum mixed with laudanum dulled the senses, made resistance useless. By the time the captives regained clarity, they were already halfway to Virginia, and the only future left was the auction block. There were cruelties even darker. Stories told of families ambushed in their own homes, children torn screaming from their parents' arms. Entire households could vanish overnight, their cabins left abandoned, cooking fires still smoldering. Survivors later described hearing the barking of dogs, the slam of wagon doors, and then only silence. The sheer brazenness of these kidnappings spread panic. Word traveled quickly in free black communities. Never walk alone, never trust a stranger, keep your children close. Parents taught their sons and daughters to run at the first sign of a white stranger asking questions. Yet fear could not stop hunger, poverty, or human trust, and the gang exploited every weakness. Even those who suspected the truth often stayed silent. Some were too terrified of retribution. Others quietly benefited from the trade, accepting bribes or turning away in exchange for favors. In a society where the law itself was tilted against the free black population, who could risk speaking out? Patty orchestrated it all with chilling precision. She was the mastermind, the one who assigned roles, the one who decided which targets were worth the risk. She was said to study families like a farmer studies fields, calculating which could be harvested with the least resistance. Her men carried out the snatching, but it was her mind that mapped the strategy. Over time, the methods became ritualized: lure, capture, conceal, transport, sell. It was a system, a grotesque mirror of the Underground Railroad, but flowing in reverse. Where one network carried souls toward freedom, Patty's gang dragged them back into bondage. And the machine ran smoothly, year after year, feeding the markets of the South with flesh stolen from the free soil of the North. By the 1820s, whole communities lived under the shadow of her methods. Disappearances were no longer isolated tragedies. They were patterns, relentless and unbroken, and still Patty Cannon remained untouchable. For every cry in the night, there was silence in the morning. If Patty Cannon's tavern was the face of her empire, then its cellars were its beating heart. On the surface, the place looked ordinary enough, a roadside inn where travelers stopped for ale, gossip, or a night's rest. But beneath the wooden floors, hidden behind trapdoors and narrow stairwells, lay chambers of silence and fear, the dungeons where kidnapped men, women, and children were held like cargo. Survivors who escaped years later described these rooms in whispers. They were dark, airless, damp with the smell of earth and rot. Chains bolted into stone walls rattled with every movement. The unlucky captives were crammed together in spaces too small to stretch out, forced to sit in their own filth, hungry and terrified of every creak above them. Some tried to scratch marks into the walls to count the days, but time dissolved quickly in the dark. Hours became indistinguishable from nights, hope from despair. Patty's gang treated the cellars as holding pens, a way station between capture and sale. Victims might remain there for days or weeks, depending on the timing of the next journey south. When wagons were ready, the trapdoor would creak open, lantern light would spill down the steps, and the chosen captives were dragged upward into the world of the living again, only to be shackled, hidden under wagon boards, and driven away into slavery. It was not only strangers who passed through those cellars. Whole families were confined there, children cried for their mothers, parents begged to trade their own lives for the freedom of their sons and daughters, but Patty had no mercy. To her, a sobbing child was not a human being, it was currency. A stronger man meant a higher price, a girl of fair skin could be sold at a premium. She looked at her captives with the cold eye of a merchant weighing livestock. And yet, there are accounts that suggest she relished the power. Some said she would descend into the cellars herself, lantern in hand, to survey her prisoners. Her presence filled the tiny room like a storm cloud. Witnesses remembered her face as expressionless, but her eyes, sharp, unflinching, spoke volumes. To the captives, she was more than a jailer. She was a predator studying prey. The cellars became infamous not only for their use, but for the sounds that seeped out of them. Neighbors and travelers spoke of hearing muffled cries at night, of voices rising from beneath the earth. Some swore they heard fists pounding desperately against the walls. Yet when asked, most admitted they told no one. Who would risk Patty Cannon's wrath? To speak out was to place one's own family in danger. And so, silence wrapped the tavern like a second set of walls. There were darker rumors still, that not all who entered the cellars ever left. Human bones were said to be buried in shallow graves around the tavern, covered hastily with soil. Skeptics dismissed these tales as exaggeration, but later discoveries of skeletal remains on her property would confirm that death was no stranger to her doorstep. The terror of the cellars reached beyond their walls. For the free black families of Delaware and Maryland, the thought of being locked in those underground chambers haunted every decision. Parents kept children indoors after dusk. Travelers banded together in groups. Songs and prayers whispered warnings about Patty Cannon's tavern, passing from mouth to mouth like a secret scripture of survival. But even fear could not halt the machinery. The wagons kept rolling, the auctions kept buying, and the cellars kept filling. To the outside world, the tavern remained a place of business, a roadside landmark. Patrons drank ale in the rooms above, while, only a few feet below, human beings sat chained in darkness. That was Patty Cannon's genius, and her horror. She made slavery and freedom coexist under one roof, so seamlessly that most chose not to notice. The cellars below were more than a prison. They were a symbol. A reminder that even in the so-called free states, bondage could claw its way back through cracks in the floorboards. And for those trapped in the dark, the tavern was not an inn, it was the mouth of hell. By the 1820s, the shadow of Patty Cannon stretched far beyond the walls of her tavern. She had become more than a criminal. She was a specter that haunted the entire countryside of Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. For free black families, her name was whispered like a curse. For white neighbors, it was muttered with unease, followed quickly by silence. The countryside itself seemed to hold its breath. Life in the rural communities of Delmarva was already precarious for free black people. They lived with the constant awareness that freedom was fragile, always at risk of being stolen. Every knock at the door after dark, every stranger on the road, carried with it the threat of disappearance. Parents forbade their children from straying too far from home. Women refused to walk alone. Men carried clubs or knives when traveling to market, knowing that even the most ordinary journey might end in shackles. The disappearances were too frequent to ignore. A farmhand who went out to chop wood never returned. A child fetching water vanished between well and doorstep. Sometimes entire families seemed to dissolve into thin air. Neighbors knew the truth, but to speak Patty Cannon's name aloud was dangerous. She was said to have ears everywhere, men loyal to her in every village tavern, every court, every sheriff's office. And so silence became its own form of survival. People looked away. They convinced themselves they had heard nothing, seen nothing. If a wagon rattled down a back road at midnight, best to turn one's face to the pillow and let it pass. If a woman screamed in the distance, best to say it was a fox crying in the woods. White landowners, too, lived with unease, though of a different sort. They feared being drawn into the storm of scandal or violence. Some profited quietly from Patty's trade, accepting bribes to look away, buying stolen labor at discount, or selling information about vulnerable families. Others simply feared retaliation. Patty's gang was known for their ruthlessness. Anyone who dared to speak against them risked waking to flames on their barn, or worse. In this way, the countryside became complicit. A web of silence stretched across towns and villages, protecting Patty Cannon more effectively than any weapon could. She did not need to buy loyalty outright. Fear purchased it for her. Travelers passing through the region carried stories to the outside world. Newspapers in Pennsylvania printed rumors of kidnappings, though often in vague terms. Ministers warned their congregations of the dangers to the colored race in the border states. Abolitionist networks began recording testimonies from survivors, piecing together a picture of the horrors on the Delmarva Peninsula. But within the region itself, fear kept most mouths shut. For the free black population, the effect was suffocating. Their lives became a constant balance of vigilance and exhaustion. Even ordinary joys, a child's laughter in a meadow, a neighbor's invitation to supper, were shadowed by the question, will this moment end in capture? Many families considered migration northward, to Philadelphia, to New York, even to Canada. Some made the journey. Many did not, either because they lacked the means or because the risks of travel were themselves terrifying. Folklore began to shape the terror. Some swore that Patty Cannon could smell freedom on the wind, that she had dogs trained to hunt free people as others hunted foxes. Stories spread of ghosts wandering the woods, spirits of those who had been taken, warning the living to flee while they still could. Children grew up with her name whispered like a bedtime threat. Misbehave, and Patty Cannon will come for you. It is difficult to measure the power of fear, but in the countryside of Delmarva, it was as real as the soil underfoot. Every disappearance deepened the silence. Every silence deepened her power. Behind every act of cruelty, behind every scream in the night, there was money. Patty Cannon was not merely a sadist. She was a businesswoman in the most twisted sense of the word. Her empire ran on profit, and human beings were its currency. The economics of slavery were vast and insatiable. In the cotton fields of the Deep South, demand for labor seemed endless. Planters needed strong backs to clear land, plant crops, and harvest under a burning sun. Every able-bodied man could fetch hundreds of dollars at auction. Women, especially young women, were valued not only for their labor, but for the possibility of producing the next generation of enslaved workers. Children, too, held a grim worth, seen as long-term investments by buyers who calculated futures in chains. Patty understood this system with ruthless clarity. She was not working at the margins of the trade. She was feeding directly into its bloodstream. For every free black man snatched from Delaware or Maryland, there was a buyer waiting in Georgia, Alabama, or Mississippi. For every child stolen from a yard, there was a planter ready to pay in gold. The reverse Underground Railroad was not chaos, it was commerce. Her gang became skilled at negotiating prices. Captives were moved south in wagons, hidden under false floors, then transferred to slave traders who took them deeper into the interior. Records are scarce, but surviving documents and testimony suggest Patty Cannon's network sold dozens, perhaps hundreds of people each year. The profits were staggering. A man purchased for a few coins in laudanum and rum at a tavern could be sold for $500 or more in New Orleans. A child, stolen with nothing but a smile and a promise, might yield $200. In a time when many farmers earned less than $300 a year, the trade was unimaginably lucrative. Money flowed into the Cannon household in a steady stream. It paid for LA and livestock and improvements to the tavern. It bought loyalty from accomplices and silence from neighbors. Some say Patty herself dressed in fine gowns and jewelry, her appearance belying the brutality that funded it. To her victims, she was a monster. To her associates, she was a provider of wealth and opportunity. But wealth was never her only reward. With money came power, the power to bend the countryside to her will, to command men's obedience, to stare down authorities who might have challenged her. Judges and sheriffs were often landowners themselves, entangled in the economics of slavery. If they suspected her crimes, many preferred to look away. After all, her captives would end up where the law already said they belonged, in bondage. What was a free black person's freedom worth compared to the smooth flow of commerce? The scale of the trade left scars across the peninsula. Families were torn apart not just emotionally but economically. Every disappearance robbed a household of labor, of income, of survival itself. Parents lost sons who might have carried the plow. Wives lost husbands who might have brought home wages. Communities lost leaders, pastors, and craftsmen. Each human theft was not just a crime against one family. It was an attack on the fragile stability of free black society. And yet to Patty Cannon, it was all numbers. She was said to keep mental tallies of her stock, calculating who could be sold immediately, who should be fattened or rested before transport, and who might fetch the highest price. Human lives were balanced against ledgers only she could see. Her nickname began to spread, the Queen of the Kidnappers. It was not meant as praise, but in the twisted economy of slavery, it had the ring of authority. She was a monarch presiding over a kingdom of stolen flesh, a ruler whose throne was built on tears and silence. This was the cruel paradox of her empire. Every act of violence was profitable, and every profit gave her the means to commit new violence. The cycle fed itself, growing larger and stronger with each passing year. By the time whispers of her crimes reached the ears of abolitionists in Philadelphia, Patty Cannon had become not just a criminal figure, but a symbol of something greater. The monstrous truth that slavery's profits were built not only on the plantations of the South, but on the thefts and betrayals of the North. By the late 1820s, Patty Cannon was no longer just another criminal lurking in the shadows of the Delmarva Peninsula. She had become a name that carried weight, a presence felt across towns and farms, taverns and courtrooms. To her victims, she was terror incarnate. To her allies, she was a leader. To her enemies, she was a force too dangerous to confront. It was in this climate that her grim title began to take root. The Queen of the Kidnappers. The name did not arise from admiration, it came from fear. But in a society where power was often measured in dominance, fear itself was a kind of crown. Patty wore it effortlessly. People spoke of her with the same tone reserved for storms or plagues, not as a person to be reasoned with, but as a calamity to be endured. Her reputation was carefully cultivated. Patty understood that violence, when used publicly, could be as powerful as secrecy. Stories spread of her cold stare, her ability to silence a room without raising her voice, her willingness to strike without hesitation. Witnesses claimed she once threatened to slit a man's throat in broad daylight for questioning her, and the man, terrified by the certainty in her eyes, never raised the issue again. The gang she led reinforced this image. Her network of kidnappers, sons, sons-in-law, and assorted criminals acted with open boldness, swaggering through markets and taverns. Their allegiance to Patty was unshakable, bound by both blood and profit. Men who might have challenged another leader deferred to her. She commanded not through brute strength but through something more dangerous, absolute confidence and the willingness to do what others would not. The Queen's reputation also spread through rumor, often exaggerated but effective. Some said she kept pistols beneath her skirts ready to draw at a moment's notice. Others swore she had a secret pact with sheriffs that the law itself bent to her will. In truth, the reality was simpler. Officials often turned a blind eye because confronting her meant risk without reward. Still, the myth of her invincibility served her well. Among free black communities, her name was invoked like a warning. Parents told children, "Stay close, or Patty Cannon will take you." It was more than a cautionary tale. It was a real and present danger. Families carried her likeness in their minds, not from portraits, but from whispered descriptions. A hard-faced woman with piercing eyes, always watching, always calculating. She became a figure larger than life, blending fact and folklore until the two were indistinguishable. The newspapers of the time, when they dared to mention her, amplified this aura. Articles hinted at her crimes but rarely spelled them out, often cloaking the truth in vague references to kidnapping bands or lawless elements near the Delaware-Maryland border. In an era where women were expected to be passive, Patty Cannon's role as the mastermind made her all the more notorious. A woman leading men in crime was shocking enough. A woman leading men in the business of stealing humans was almost unimaginable. It is said that even rival gangs respected her, or at least feared entangling with her. The tavern she controlled was both a headquarters and a symbol. Travelers who stopped there often left with unease, noting the watchful eyes, the strange silence that fell when her name was spoken. In a world where most women were confined to the domestic sphere, Patty had carved out a dominion of crime and ruled it with an iron hand. But the title Queen was not only about control, it carried with it the inevitability of downfall. Monarchs attract attention, and attention breeds enemies. By crowning herself in fear, Patty Cannon ensured that her reign would one day face a reckoning. For now, though she stood untouchable, her power reaching its peak. The Queen of the Kidnappers was more than a woman. She was an institution of terror, a living reminder that law and morality could be bent by profit, silence, and fear. For every tale of Patty Cannon's cruelty, there were also whispers of defiance. Not all who fell into her clutches went quietly into bondage. Some resisted with courage, others with cunning, and a few lived to tell their stories. These fragments of resistance were like cracks in the walls of her empire, small at first, but proof that even the Queen of Kidnappers was not invincible. One such story belonged to a young woman named Lydia Smith. She had been born free in Delaware, the daughter of a carpenter. One autumn evening, she vanished while returning from a neighbor's house. Witnesses later recalled seeing a wagon with a false bottom leaving the area. Lydia was trapped inside, drugged and bound. For days she was moved southward, her captors confident that she, like so many others, would soon disappear forever into the cotton fields. But Lydia did not surrender. Somewhere along the road, she slipped free of her bindings, and when the gang grew careless, she bolted into the woods. Pursued by dogs and men, she hid in swamps and ditches, surviving on roots and rainwater until she found her way to a Quaker household sympathetic to her plight. They smuggled her north, and in time she reached Philadelphia, where abolitionists recorded her testimony. Lydia's voice would later echo in courtrooms and newspapers, a rare living witness against the Cannon gang. Other stories were less fortunate but no less defiant. Men fought back with fists, rocks, or knives, sometimes wounding their captors, sometimes dying in the attempt. Mothers clung to their children so fiercely that it took several men to wrench them apart. On more than one occasion, gangs transporting captives were attacked by small groups of free black neighbors, though these attempts were perilous, often ending with brutal reprisals from Patty's crew. The Underground Railroad, though still fragile in these years, began to take notice. Abolitionist networks in Pennsylvania collected testimonies from escapees, building a map of Patty Cannon's operations. These stories circulated in secret pamphlets, sermons, and speeches. Each account was a spark, kindling outrage in the North and slowly eroding the silence that shielded her empire. Even within her own ranks, resistance simmered. Not every member of the Cannon gang was loyal forever. Some were driven by greed, but others, troubled by guilt or fear of eventual punishment, broke away. A few turned informer, passing scraps of information to authorities or abolitionists. Though the law moved slowly, each betrayal weakened Patty's grip. What made these stories of resistance so powerful was their rarity. The machinery of kidnapping was designed to erase lives, to make people vanish without a trace. To survive, to escape, and to speak aloud what had happened was an act of defiance not only against Patty Cannon, but against the entire system that enabled her. Yet resistance also carried heavy costs. Families who harbored escapees risked violent retaliation. Witnesses who dared testify often faced intimidation or worse. The countryside's fear was not unfounded. Patty's gang had proven willing to burn barns, poison livestock, and even murder those who crossed them. Still, the stories endured. They traveled by word of mouth, carried in whispers from kitchen to church to marketplace. They became warnings, but also seeds of courage. Every successful escape reminded others that survival was possible. Every testimony recorded by abolitionists chipped away at the wall of denial that had allowed Patty Cannon to thrive. For the Queen of the Kidnappers, these stories were dangerous. They threatened to turn silence into speech, fear into outrage. And though her reign remained strong, the murmurs of resistance were growing louder, reaching the ears of judges, journalists, and politicians who could no longer pretend ignorance. In the darkness of her cellars, where captives once wept in despair, there lingered also the memory of those who fought back, proof that even in the face of overwhelming cruelty, the human spirit strained toward freedom. For years, Patty Cannon's tavern sat like an ordinary landmark along the road, smoke curling from its chimney, wagons rattling past, neighbors nodding politely as they passed. To the casual eye, it was a place of laughter, drink, and lodging. But beneath the veneer of hospitality lay secrets buried not only in cellars, but in the very earth itself. The first discoveries came quietly, almost by accident. A farmer tilling his field near the Nanticoke River turned up bones, human bones, worn and weathered. At first he thought them to be relics of some long-forgotten burial ground, but as more fragments emerged, skulls with cracked crowns, ribs snapped unnaturally, small bones unmistakably belonging to children, the truth became harder to ignore. These were not ancient remains. These were the dead of Patty Cannon's reign. Neighbors whispered, but fear held their tongues. In the early 1800s, finding bones was not uncommon. The peninsula was dotted with unmarked graves, Native American burial grounds, and casualties of old wars. Yet something about these discoveries felt different. Too many skeletons, too shallowly buried, too many signs of violence. As rumors spread, travelers added their own accounts. Some swore they had glimpsed bodies being carried from the tavern at night wrapped in burlap sacks. Others spoke of strange smells drifting from freshly turned soil behind the house. Still others recalled hearing muffled cries beneath the floorboards before those cries were silenced forever. It was said that Patty Cannon's property became a graveyard of last resort. Those captives who proved too resistant, too sick, or too young to fetch a high price simply vanished. Their bodies were disposed of in pits dug under the cover of darkness. Infants, some claimed, were smothered at birth and discarded without ceremony. Men who fought back were beaten to death, their remains hid, and beneath orchards and pastures. By the time lawmen finally searched the land years later, the soil gave up its grim harvest. They unearthed skeletons of men, women, and children, many bearing marks of violence. The discoveries confirmed what survivors and abolitionists had long suspected, that Patty Cannon's empire was not only built on kidnapping and sale, but also on murder. Forensic science, as we know it, did not exist in the 1820s, yet even the crude investigations of the day revealed enough to horrify. One report noted the presence of chains still clasped to bones. Another described skulls with holes that appeared to have been smashed with blunt objects. These findings circulated in newspapers, shocking readers in both the North and South. The grave sites became more than evidence. They became symbols. To abolitionists, they were proof of the dehumanizing brutality at the heart of slavery. To locals, they were a stain on the community, a reminder of how silence and complicity had allowed evil to fester in their midst. Parents pointed to the fields and told children never to wander there, as if the soil itself were cursed by the restless dead. Yet for years, long before the law took action, the bones served only as whispers of truth. Farmers who stumbled upon them often reburied the remains quietly, unwilling to invite trouble. Neighbors averted their eyes. Fear of retaliation kept many silent, while others told themselves that what they had seen must have some explanation less terrible than the one they dreaded. Still, the dead do not stay silent forever. Each bone turned up by a plough, each skull uncovered by a rainstorm, was a testimony louder than any witness. The land itself was speaking, demanding reckoning. And in time, those bones would play their part in bringing down the queen of the kidnappers. For no empire, however powerful, can bury its crimes for river. The spring sun had barely lifted above the trees when a farmer named Jacob Wells guided his plough across a narrow strip of land near the Maryland-Delaware border. He was an ordinary man, tending ordinary soil, his mind on nothing more than the day's work and the season's harvest. But that morning, his plough struck something that changed the course of local history. At first, Jacob thought it was a tree root. The blade jarred suddenly, and the horses shied. He stooped to clear the obstruction, but instead of wood, he saw the curve of bone. He froze. The pale fragment jutted from the earth, oddly shaped, fragile. With shaking hands, he brushed away more soil, and there, unmistakably, was a skull staring back at him. Jacob staggered backward. He had seen bones before, old graves, scattered remains from battles long past. But this was different. The skull was fresh enough to still hold its shape. And worse, nearby in the soil, he spotted the tiny bones of a child. His stomach turned. News of the discovery traveled quickly, despite efforts to contain it. Neighbors gathered, muttering in disbelief as Jacob unearthed more remains. Soon there were not one or two, but several skeletons, tangled together in shallow ground. Some bore marks no plough could have caused, splintered ribs, broken skulls. Whispers spread like wildfire. These were not old graves, these were victims. The whispers reached the local sheriff, who reluctantly came to inspect the site. Law enforcement in those days was cautious, often complicit in turning a blind eye to Patty Cannon's activities. But the farmer's discovery was too stark to dismiss. The sheriff, grim-faced, ordered a more thorough search. Over the next days, more bodies emerged from the soil, men, women, and children, their silent testimony undeniable. Panic spread through the countryside, families who had long suspected the truth but never dared. To voice it now faced the evidence directly. The skeletons proved what had only been whispered. Patty Cannon's land was not just a stopover for kidnappers, but a graveyard for those who did not survive her trade. For Jacob Wells, the discovery was a curse. Some neighbors warned him to keep quiet, fearing retaliation. Others urged him to go to the newspapers, to expose the horror fully. He wrestled with fear and conscience, knowing that to speak openly might bring Patty Cannon's wrath upon him, but also knowing that silence would make him complicit. The press eventually caught wind of the discovery, and reports began to circulate. One newspaper described the site as a charnel ground of human woe. Another wrote, "The earth yields its dreadful testimony against the perpetrators of the kidnapping trade." The story spread beyond Delaware, shocking readers in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. The farmer's discovery became a turning point. While many in power had ignored rumors for years, bones in the soil could not be dismissed as hearsay. They demanded accountability, they forced lawmen to act, and they provided abolitionists with proof, physical evidence of the horrors lurking in the borderlands. Patty Cannon herself tried to shrug off the accusations. She claimed the bones were ancient, remnants of old burials. Her defenders echoed this explanation, insisting that nothing tied her directly to the graves, but the sheer number of remains and their proximity to her property made such denials ring hollow. In truth, Jacob Wells had unearthed more than bones. He had unearthed the beginning of the end for the queen of the kidnappers. The soil that had long concealed her crimes now betrayed her, revealing the evidence she could not silence. And though Patty still held power, the tide was turning. The ground itself had spoken, and its testimony could not be buried again. The discovery of human remains on Patty Cannon's land sent ripples through the Delmarva Peninsula. What had once been rumor and whisper now stood as grim fact. The ground itself had betrayed her, and with it, the silence that had protected her empire for decades began to unravel. Authorities, long hesitant to act, were forced into motion. The sheriff convened an inquiry, summoning neighbors to testify. Though many were terrified to speak, some finally broke their silence. A tavern keeper admitted to hearing muffled cries when passing Patty's house at night. A farmer confessed he had once seen wagons leaving her property at odd hours, heavy with cargo that shifted and moaned. These accounts, combined with the bones unearthed by Jacob Wells, painted a picture too damning to ignore. At the same time, abolitionist networks seized upon the news. In Philadelphia and New York, anti-slavery societies circulated broadsheets detailing the grisly findings. Pamphlets bore lurid headlines: "The Monster of the Borderlands," "The Queen of the Kidnappers Exposed." For years they had relied on the testimonies of fugitives, but now they had tangible evidence that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Within Patty's own circle, cracks began to appear. Her sons-in-law and gang members, once fiercely loyal, grew nervous. Some feared arrest. Others worried that Patty, in her arrogance, would let them all fall together. Quiet defections began. Men who had once terrorized communities now slipped away under cover of night, leaving the gang weakened and divided. The law tightened its gaze. Officers began searching not only Patty's land, but also the surrounding woods, rivers, and abandoned sheds. More bones were found. Chains buried with skeletons, rusted manacles caked with dirt. Each discovery hardened public outrage. No longer could her defenders argue that these were ancient graves. The instruments of bondage buried alongside the victims told the story plainly. Witnesses who had once hidden in fear now stepped forward. A man named Isaac, formerly enslaved but later freed, testified that he had been held in Patty Cannon's cellar before escaping. His words, combined with the discoveries, gave investigators a direct link between her property and the trade in human beings. The newspapers, emboldened by the evidence, grew bolder in their condemnation. One editorial thundered, "What judge or sheriff can now stand idle when the earth itself cries out with the bones of the murdered?" The pressure on local officials mounted. To ignore the scandal was to risk their own reputations, even their offices. For Patty, the walls were closing in. She remained outwardly calm, still playing the role of the commanding matriarch, but those close to her noticed cracks in her composure. She drank more heavily. Her temper flared more often. She lashed out at her remaining allies, accusing them of betrayal. For the first time, the Queen of the Kidnappers seemed to sense that her throne was slipping. Yet even as the net tightened, she did not surrender easily. Rumors swirled that she burned documents and destroyed records, erasing traces of her dealings. Some claimed she moved captives farther south in a desperate bid to keep her profits flowing. Others whispered that she plotted to flee entirely, to vanish into the south where lawmen from Delaware or Maryland could not reach her. But Patty Cannon's name had become too infamous, her crimes too visible. Escape was no longer possible. Each passing week brought new discoveries, new testimonies, and new demands for justice. The Queen, who had ruled by fear, now found herself the object of a different kind of fear, the fear of exposure, trial, and the gallows. The once silent countryside now buzzed with the sound of reckoning. The law was stirring, the abolitionists were shouting, and even the soil had risen against her. The Queen of the Kidnappers was running out of time. The discovery of human remains on Patty Cannon's land sent ripples through the Delmarva Peninsula. What had once been rumor and whisper now stood as grim fact. The ground itself had betrayed her, and with it, the silence that had protected her empire for decades began to unravel. Authorities, long hesitant to act, were forced into motion. The sheriff convened an inquiry, summoning neighbors to testify. Though many were terrified to speak, some finally broke their silence. A tavern keeper admitted to hearing muffled cries when passing Patty's house at night. A farmer confessed he had once seen wagons leaving her property at odd hours, heavy with cargo that shifted and moaned. These accounts, combined with the bones unearthed by Jacob Wells, painted a picture too damning to ignore. At the same time, abolitionist networks seized upon the news. In Philadelphia and New York, anti-slavery societies circulated broadsheets detailing the grisly findings. Pamphlets bore lurid headlines: "The Monster of the Borderlands," "The Queen of the Kidnappers Exposed." For years they had relied on the testimonies of fugitives, but now they had tangible evidence that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Within Patty's own circle, cracks began to appear. Her sons-in-law and gang members, once fiercely loyal, grew nervous. Some feared arrest. Others worried that Patty, in her arrogance, would let them all fall together. quiet defections began. Men who had once terrorized communities now slipped away under cover of night, leaving the gang weakened and divided. The law tightened its gaze. Officers began searching not only Patty's land, but also the surrounding woods, rivers, and abandoned sheds. More bones were found. Chains buried with skeletons, rusted manacles caked with dirt. Each discovery hardened public outrage. No longer could her defenders argue that these were ancient graves. The instruments of bondage buried alongside the victims told the story plainly. Witnesses who had once hidden in fear now stepped forward. A man named Isaac, formerly enslaved but later freed, testified that he had been held in Patty Cannon's cellar before escaping. His words, combined with the discoveries, gave investigators a direct link between her property and the trade in human beings. The newspapers, emboldened by the evidence, grew bolder in their condemnation. One editorial thundered, "What judge or sheriff can now stand idle when the earth itself cries out with the bones of the murdered?" The pressure on local officials mounted. To ignore the scandal was to risk their own reputations, even their offices. For Patty, the walls were closing in. She remained outwardly calm, still playing the role of the commanding matriarch, but those close to her noticed cracks in her composure. She drank more heavily. Her temper flared more often. She lashed out at her remaining allies, accusing them of betrayal. For the first time, the Queen of the Kidnappers seemed to sense that her throne was slipping. Yet even as the net tightened, she did not surrender easily. Rumors swirled that she burned documents and destroyed records, erasing traces of her dealings. Some claimed she moved captives farther south in a desperate bid to keep her profits flowing. Others whispered that she plotted to flee entirely, to vanish into the south where lawmen from Delaware or Maryland could not reach her. But Patty Cannon's name had become too infamous, her crimes too visible. Escape was no longer possible. Each passing week brought new discoveries, new testimonies, and new demands for justice. The Queen, who had ruled by fear, now found herself the object of a different kind of fear, the fear of exposure, trial, and the gallows. The once silent countryside now buzzed with the sound of reckoning. The law was stirring, the abolitionists were shouting, and even the soil had risen against her. The Queen of the Kidnappers was running out of time. When Patty Cannon was brought to trial in Georgetown, Delaware in 1829, it was no ordinary proceeding. Word of her arrest had spread across the nation, and people flocked to the courthouse as if attending a spectacle. Farmers abandoned their fields, merchants closed their shops, and townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder in the square, straining for a glimpse of the woman who had haunted their nightmares for decades. The courthouse itself groaned under the weight of curiosity. Every bench was filled, and those who could not find a seat crowded at the windows. Newspapers dispatched reporters to cover every moment, sending breathless accounts to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York. They called it the trial of the century, a phrase not used lightly in an age when courtrooms often decided matters of life and death. Patty Cannon was led in wearing a simple prison gown, her once commanding presence diminished by the iron shackles clinking at her wrists and ankles. Yet her eyes still burned with the sharp intelligence and defiance that had carried her through years of crime. She scanned the courtroom with a look that seemed to say she was still the master of the stage. The charges against her were read. Multiple counts of kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder. The most damning evidence came from the bodies unearthed on her property. Witness after witness testified about the bones found, the chains buried with the dead, and the shallow graves dug under her orchards. Survivors described the terror of being confined in her cellar, of hearing the cries of others who never returned. Among the witnesses was Lydia Smith, the young woman who had escaped Patty's clutches years before. Her voice trembled as she described being drugged, dragged, and imprisoned, only to break free by sheer luck. She spoke of others who were not so fortunate, of families torn apart, and of the nightmares that followed her to this day. The courtroom sat in hushed silence as her words painted a vivid picture of Patty Cannon's cruelty. Former gang members also took the stand, eager to save themselves by condemning their leader. They testified to her ruthlessness, to the orders she gave to silence captives who resisted, and to the nights when she supervised the digging of shallow graves. Some claimed she had personally wielded the weapon that ended lives. Their stories differed in detail, but together they formed a tapestry of horror. The defense tried to undermine the credibility of the witnesses. They argued that the bones could belong to ancient burials, that the accusations came from abolitionist agitators, and that Patty herself was being scapegoated because she was a woman in a man's trade. Her lawyers painted her as a victim of hysteria, a target of rumor magnified by fear. But the tide of evidence was overwhelming. Chains fused to bones, skulls with fractures too deliberate to be accidents. Testimony from both the free and the formerly enslaved. Survivors who bore scars not only on their bodies, but on their memories. The newspapers sensationalized every word. One reporter wrote, "Never before has such a parade of horrors been laid bare in open court. The crimes of Patty Cannon surpassed the darkest imaginations of Gothic fiction." Another declared, "If justice be true, the gallows shall soon claim the queen of the kidnappers." Throughout it all, Patty Cannon sat unmoved. Some said she smirked during the testimony, as if mocking the proceedings. Others swore they saw fear flicker across her face when the bones were brought into evidence. Whether arrogant or haunted, she gave little away. By the trial's end, there was no doubt in the public mind. The jury retired to deliberate, but the verdict seemed certain even before they left their seats, guilty or no. Patty Cannon's reign was finished. She would never again walk free across the borderlands, yet fate, as it often does, would take an unexpected turn before the gallows could have their due. The jury's verdict was never formally delivered in the way the public expected. Though the evidence was damning, and though the courtroom buzzed with certainty of her guilt, Patty Cannon's fate took a darker, quieter turn behind the walls of her cell. Locked in Georgetown jail, Patty waited for sentencing. For a woman who had once commanded a small empire of terror, the confinement was suffocating. The cell was damp, its stone walls weeping with moisture, its single-barred window too narrow to offer even a sliver of freedom. Rats scurried across the floor at night, and the straw mattress reeked of mildew. But it wasn't the conditions of her cell that broke her spirit. It was the inevitability. For the first time in her life, she had no cards left to play. Her influence, her bribes, her threats, all had collapsed under the weight of the bones pulled from the earth. She knew the law would not spare her. The gallows loomed in her future, and the thought of a public hanging with crowds jeering her as the rope tightened around her neck gnawed at her pride. In those final weeks, jailers reported her mood shifting wildly. At times she raged, screaming curses at the guards, vowing that she would return from the grave to haunt them. At other times she fell into silence, staring at the stone wall for hours, her eyes dull and far away. Some claimed she muttered names in the night, perhaps of her victims, perhaps of the children she had lost to her own schemes. The newspapers followed her every move, publishing lurid descriptions of her downfall. "The once powerful matron now sits in fetters," one article read, "a wretched shadow of the tyrant who ruled the borderlands." Public opinion was merciless. Many demanded that she hang, insisting that no woman, however old or frail, should be spared the gallows when so many had perished by her hand. But Patty Cannon would deny the public spectacle. One morning in May 1829, the jailer found her slumped on the floor of her cell, a vial of poison beside her. How she obtained it remains a mystery, perhaps smuggled in by a sympathizer, perhaps hidden on her person long before her arrest. What is certain is that she had chosen her own end. The news spread quickly. Patty Cannon was dead. Some rejoiced, satisfied that she had at last paid for her crimes. Others felt cheated, robbed of the justice of seeing her hang before the eyes of the community she had terrorized. Ministers thundered from pulpits that she had damned her soul by denying herself the opportunity for repentance. Abolitionists seized upon her suicide as proof of her guilt, declaring that she could not face divine or earthly judgment. Her body, it was said, was buried in the potter's field, though accounts vary. Some whispered that her corpse was exhumed for medical study, that her skull was taken by a doctor and passed down for generations as a morbid curiosity. Whether fact or legend, the tale of her skull became part of the mythology surrounding her, an object as infamous as the woman herself. Patty Cannon's death by poison ended her life, but not her story. She had escaped the hangman's noose, but not the judgment of history. To the communities she had plundered, she remained a figure of fear and hatred, her name a curse spoken in hushed tones. To the abolitionists, she became a symbol of the kidnapping trade's cruelty, a villain whose reign exposed the urgent need to protect free black citizens from predators hiding behind the mask of legality. The queen of the kidnappers was gone, but the scars she left on the land and on the people would endure long after the poison stilled her heart. Patty Cannon's death did not silence her story, it magnified it. In the months and years after her demise, her name lingered like a curse across the Delmarva Peninsula. Mothers warned their children not to stray too far from home, whispering, "Patty Cannon will get you," as if she was still alive and lurking in the woods, her legend blurred into folklore, half history, half ghost story. The communities most scarred by her reign bore the heaviest weight. Families of free black citizens who had vanished never recovered their loved ones. Some kept hope alive long after her death, believing that perhaps their kin had survived somewhere in the deep south. Others resigned themselves to silence, knowing the graves unearthed on her property were likely only a fraction of those she had buried. The trauma lingered, passed down through generations as a warning about the dangers of complacency and the cruelty of unchecked power. Abolitionists used her crimes as a rallying cry. Pamphlets and speeches referenced the reign of the infamous Patty Cannon as proof that the kidnapping trade was not an isolated evil, but part of a broader system of corruption that fed slavery. In Philadelphia, one writer thundered, "If such horrors can flourish within the borders of a free state, what then must be the condition of the enslaved across the South?" Her story became ammunition in the growing battle over the soul of the nation. Even the white neighbors who had once feared her grappled with her memory. Some admitted their silence had enabled her. Others tried to distance themselves, insisting they had known nothing of the crimes. Yet the truth was plain. Too many had chosen not to see what was in front of them. Too many had traded safety for silence. The shame of that complicity lingered like a second shadow to Patty's reign. Folklore began to grow around her grave, or what people believed to be her grave. Some swore they saw her ghost wandering the roads at night, searching for new victims. Others claimed her scream could still be heard on stormy evenings near the Nanticoke River. Children dared each other to approach the site of her former house, the so-called kidnapping house, said to be cursed. Whether true or not, these tales kept her presence alive long after her body had rotted in the ground. Historians too grappled with her legacy. Court records, newspaper accounts, and survivor testimonies preserved fragments of her story, though many details blurred in contradiction. Some portrayed her as a calculating mastermind, others as a drunk and violent woman carried along by the schemes of her gang. The truth lay somewhere between. She was both ruthless and opportunistic, both shrewd enough to profit from kidnapping and brutal enough to kill to maintain control. Artifacts added to her myth. A rusted set of chains said to come from her property was displayed in a local museum. The story of her skull, supposedly kept by a doctor for phrenological study, passed into local legend, with whispers that it had been used in carnival sideshows. Each relic, whether real or imagined, gave substance to the horror she had left behind. But perhaps the deepest legacy was not the folklore or the artifacts, but the fear she had planted in the hearts of free black families. Her reign reminded them that freedom in the North was fragile, that laws and neighbors could not always be trusted to protect them. It was a lesson carried forward, shaping how communities organized, resisted, and defended themselves in the years leading to the Civil War. Patty Cannon had lived by fear and died in disgrace, yet in death she remained powerful, not in command, but as a warning of what happens when greed is given free rein, when cruelty is allowed to fester, and when silence lets evil grow unchecked. Her terror had ended, but her shadow had only just begun. The story of Patty Cannon was not just the tale of one woman's cruelty, it was a window into the fractured, violent world of early 19th century America. Her reign revealed how fragile freedom could be on the borderlands, where the boundaries between slavery and liberty blurred, and where greed thrived in the shadows cast by weak laws and silent neighbors. In the border states, geography was destiny. To the north lay Pennsylvania, a free state that promised liberty to those who escaped slavery. To the south lay Maryland and Delaware's plantation economy, deeply tied to human bondage. Caught in between, the Delmarva Peninsula became a contested landscape, a place where slave catchers, abolitionists, runaways, and kidnappers collided. It was here, in this liminal zone, that Patty Cannon built her empire of terror. Her crimes underscored the vulnerability of free black people in America. Freedom papers could be ignored, burned, or declared fraudulent. Courts often sided with the word of a white captor over that of a black victim. Local officials, reluctant to cross powerful neighbors or confront violent gangs, looked the other way. In this environment, Patty Cannon's enterprise thrived. She was not simply a rogue actor, she was the product of a system that tolerated kidnapping because it served the economic hunger for enslaved labor farther south. The persistence of her gang revealed another truth. Evil rarely flourishes alone. Patty had accomplices, family members, neighbors, traders, and corrupt officials who all profited from the traffic in human lives. Some guarded the captives, others arranged sales, still others kept silent out of fear or complicity. Her story illustrates a sobering lesson. Silence can be as dangerous as cruelty. Without the tacit approval of her community, her reign could never have lasted so long. But her downfall also showed the power of resistance. Abolitionists, black communities, and determined individuals like Lydia Smith fought back, raising their voices and their stories until the authorities could no longer ignore them. Their courage forced the hand of the law, bringing an end to decades of violence. In that sense, the capture of Patty Cannon was not simply the fall of a criminal, but a testament to the endurance and resilience of those she tried to destroy. Her life also reflected the contradictions of gender in her era. Women were expected to be docile, nurturing, submissive, yet Patty Cannon defied those norms, wielding authority, commanding men, and using violence in ways that shocked contemporaries. Some newspapers struggled to describe her, calling her unnatural or a monster in female form. But her gender did not make her crimes any less real. Instead, it revealed how society underestimated women's capacity for both leadership and cruelty, a blind spot she exploited to her advantage. In the larger arc of American history, Patty Cannon's reign is a reminder of how lawlessness and slavery were intertwined. The trade in kidnapped free blacks blurred the lines between the legal and the illegal, the sanctioned and the forbidden. It was a symptom of a nation deeply divided, a place where the ideals of liberty coexisted with the reality of bondage. Her story foreshadowed the conflicts that would eventually erupt into civil war. For the people of Delmarva, the lesson was more personal. Her terror taught communities that justice delayed was justice denied, and that silence in the face of evil allowed it to grow unchecked. For generations after, her name was invoked, not just as a bogeyman for children, but as a cautionary tale for adults. A reminder of what happens when greed and cruelty are allowed to flourish in the shadows. Patty Cannon's story endures because it is not just about her. It is about the borderlands themselves, about the fragile line between freedom and slavery, about the choices communities make in the face of fear. It is about the victims who resisted, survived, and told their stories so that history would not forget. The queen of the kidnappers was gone, but the lessons of her reign still speak to us today. Lessons about complicity, about courage, and about the price of silence. The story of Patty Cannon closes not with her trial, nor even with her poisoned death, but with the long shadow she cast across the land she once terrorized. Her reign ended nearly 2 centuries ago, yet the echoes of her crimes continue to reverberate in memory, folklore, and history. For the families she tore apart, the scars never fully healed. Generations passed down stories of vanished loved ones, of children who never returned, of freedom stolen in the dead of night. In black communities along the Chesapeake, her name became shorthand for the dangers that lurked even in so-called free soil. Her legacy was not merely a tale of crime, it was a reminder of the fragile line between liberty and bondage, and of the vigilance required to protect it. In the broader American memory, Patty Cannon became a symbol of the kidnapping trade that preyed on free black citizens in the North. While her story was extraordinary in scale and brutality, it was not unique. Dozens of kidnappers, slave traders, and human traffickers operated with impunity in the early 19th century, shielded by profit and indifference. Patty's infamy endures because she embodied that cruelty so completely, and because her downfall revealed the depth of the system that sustained her. Folklore kept her alive in ways the courtroom never could. For decades, children in Delaware and Maryland were warned, "Behave, or Patty Cannon will come for you." Travelers spoke of ghostly sightings along the Nanticoke River, of strange lights flickering near the ruins of her old home, of screams carried on the wind. Whether believed or not, these stories gave shape to the community's lingering fear. Evil had left its mark, and the land remembered. Yet alongside the horror lies another legacy, the courage of those who resisted. Survivors who escaped her captivity told their stories at great personal risk, ensuring the truth was heard. Abolitionists who exposed her crimes helped awaken the public to the dangers faced by free Black Americans. Neighbors who finally broke their silence forced the law to act, even when it was inconvenient. Their bravery ensured that Patty Cannon's reign did not continue unchecked into another generation. Today, her story stands as both a warning and a lesson. It warns us of what happens when greed, racism, and silence are allowed to thrive. It teaches us that evil rarely operates alone. It grows in the cracks of neglect, in the spaces where communities look away, and it reminds us that justice, though often delayed, can be demanded and won through persistence and courage. Patty Cannon was a woman of her time, but also beyond it. She exploited the divisions of a nation struggling with slavery, used violence and fear to maintain her power, and chose poison over facing the gallows. In doing so, she became larger than life, a figure remembered not for greatness, but for infamy. Her shadow remains on the Delmarva Peninsula, in the history books, and in the whispered folklore of the region. But it is not her shadow alone that matters, it is what we choose to see in it. Do we see only the monster, and in doing so, comfort ourselves that such evil is rare and long past? Or do we see the community that enabled her, the silence that allowed her crimes to flourish, and the victims whose suffering shaped the world around them? The queen of the kidnappers is long gone. Her bones, like those she buried, have crumbled to dust, but the questions she leaves behind are very much alive. Questions about justice, about complicity, about the cost of silence. And so her story ends, not with triumph, but with a reckoning. A reckoning with the truth that evil leaves scars, but also that resistance leaves legacies. A reckoning with the reminder that freedom must be defended, and not just declared. Patty Cannon may be dead, but the lessons of her shadow remain.